Hey, Cypher here. It's been a while since I proposed doing this episode. A long time ago, I did something similar about cell phones. The idea here is that inventions are often not as new as we think. For instance, did you know Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb? Seriously, he didn't. The light bulb was invented long before he was even born. In 1809, an arc light bulb was invented by Humphrey Davy. Edison came up with a way of making them burn for long periods of time because his lab experimented with the right kind of filament to put between the arc and how to make the bulb stop from fouling up. What he patented was the practical incandescent light bulb. So even the thing we use to symbolize a new idea reveals that we have a poor understanding of the nature of invention. It does not come as some mystical aha moment, but from iterating on the past by knowing the history of what is being invented. Invention requires understanding the history of that product. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. So that's what I'm going to show today, that the Wright Brothers weren't the inventors of flight, but part of a long process of iterative technological development. That process is so convoluted that we should have trouble saying who was the inventor. In fact, that's the nature of innovation. Almost anything you can name is invented in this way. So, we as a species have been trying to fly as long as we've imagined it. People concocted tales of wearing wings and taking flight. Icarus was a cautionary tale of such machinations. We not only thought of taking to the skies, but warned of how one could go too far. Icarus was indeed a harbinger of much to come. Many dreamt of flight, but only sent objects into the air. Long before written records, bows, atlatls, and catapults sent their missiles into the high parabolic trajectory of any thrown object. But an enterprising Chinese man wished to harness the wind. Sails had harnessed that power centuries prior, but the kite brought the first aerofoil to fruition. These flying devices were known at least as early as the 5th century BC. Centuries later, an emperor experimented with strapping prisoners to kites and sending them to their doom. While certainly not the most efficient form of execution, I guess it was an entertaining one. It appears that a victim did survive these tests, but we don't know much. Not a great start for manned flight. Kite sailing might have continued to develop because Marco Polo reported half a century later that people strapped themselves to such devices and were carried upon the wind, driven by ships to stay aloft. Half a millennium after that, Japan had accounts of architects and thieves using kites to get atop buildings, often powered by pack animals or men on the ground. I guess that's powered heavier than air flight, centuries before we think of it. But these manned flights were often described fancifully. Further west, perhaps the earliest record of someone trying to do this was in the 9th century AD. A mathematician by the name of Abbas ibn Firnas jumped from a tower in Spain with feathers pasted all over him. 2 centuries later, a monk by the name of Aylmer tried to do the same thing but with glider wings. He supposedly went as far as a couple hundred meters. These attempts were practically medieval legends, but it kept the dream alive. Even Leonardo da Vinci designed his own flying machines, but these were all merely experiments. Scientific theory had to catch up with the design of flying machines. With Newton's laws put down in the 17th century, people began to theorize how such a machine could work. Ideas for gliders and airships were postulated. Nothing was made possible for people yet. The real spark would be lit by another Chinese invention, the sky lantern. It dated back to the 3rd century AD, but was never used for manned flight. 2 brothers in 1782 began experimenting with making a sky lantern big enough to hold their weight, and even pilot it upon the winds. A year later, they succeeded. The first hot air balloon was set aloft to the world's astonishment. The Montgolfier brothers had invented flight more than a century before the Kitty Hawk flights. But these two were in competition with another group. Lighter elements, such as hydrogen, had been discovered in the 17th century, as with hydrogen balloons. But it took a certain amount of ingenuity to build this into something that could carry a person. They experimented around the same time as the Montgolfiers, and mere months after the hot air balloon took its inaugural manned flight, they left the ground in the inaugural flight of a hydrogen balloon. With these two lighter-than-air technologies building upon one another, ballooning became a phenomenon. People even began to use propulsion only a few years later, with one crossing the English Channel using flapping wings like oars in 1785. Propulsion was the new frontier of flight. These odd means were not going to get people very far. They needed the propeller. The technology was actually well known by the turn of the 19th century. Helicopter toys were known throughout the world. You could make them with leaves and sticks, even bamboo, for the blades. The Archimedes screw had led to steam-powered ships, and the same principle was applied to flight. By the 1850s, propellers were driving balloons, called dirigibles. This is also when observation balloons began to be used in warfare, which culminated in the extensive use of them during the American Civil War. The first aircraft carrier was made in 1861 specifically for aerial surveillance. Essentially, they strapped balloons to a ship, but that's an aircraft carrier. The technology continued to progress, with rigid airships coming in the 1870s, but they wouldn't become practical for transportation until 1900. But all of this was lighter than air. Heavier than air flight took more time to develop. People experimented with how to power it with things like spring-wound contraptions as early as the 1650s. None of these were powerful enough to put a man in the air. They initially tried to design these things with flapping wings, called ornithopters, but these were never successful. An Englishman named George Catlin had paid attention to the development of ornithopters and kites, and he combined these two things into a design that was revolutionary. In 1809, he published On Aerial Navigation. He began theorizing how to make fixed-wing gliders. While it took time for people to follow his progress, by the 1840s he was making functioning gliders. His most famous design was made in 1852, called a governable parachute. Now they just needed it to be self-propelled. A patent for a steam-powered glider based on Catlin's design called the aerial steam carriage was patented in 1842, but steam engines were too heavy to get it off the ground. A decade later, Jean-Marie Lebris powered a glider by hitching it to a horse. Much like the kite flyers rumored in Asia, powered heavier-than-air flight was invented again, but this time it was controllable. The only problem was that the power was derived from the ground. Engine technology needed to get lighter, and better designs needed to be more aerodynamic. Ailerons and better wings were invented, and by 1874 a working steam-powered monoplane was made. The problem was that a person couldn't get on it, because they'd overweigh it. Eventually, steam would be overtaken by internal combustion, but it was not immediate. People designed better and better unmanned planes. So the race was on for the first manned version. A German immigrant in Connecticut named Gustav Whitehead started designing his own. He claimed to have flown with one of his planes in 1901 and 1902. These claims have generally been disbelieved, but could very well have been real. People were trying to fly all over the place, so people claiming they had succeeded needed more verification than simple local newspaper accounts. But everyone could read the reports. It was a community effort. There were several other claimants, including Lyman Gilmore in California and Richard Pearce in New Zealand. Someone needed to make a fully documented flight, and it seemed like 1903 would produce one. That year, a German by the name of Karl Hotto made what were considered only hops. But this was powered flights, they were just hops. So the Wright brothers had obviously been paying attention to recent developments, and they made their own flyer and took off. This time, it was well documented, but there was a problem with their design. It was not powerful enough to take off on its own. So because it had to use a launch, numerous claimants challenged the Wright brothers. Perhaps the one thing they can definitely claim is that they created a full 3-axis aerial control, which was quickly adopted throughout the aviation community. But notice, I said aviation community. They were part of a larger group trying to develop flight. They were not some lone inventors working all on their own in some bicycle-making shed. Everyone was trying to fly with all kinds of zany contraptions, with no one having a clearly defined first flight. It was so contentious a title that the Smithsonian refused to recognize the Wright brothers as the first flight for half a century. Everybody was iterating on the design, and the Smithsonian had its own claimant. Samuel Pierpont Langley denied the claim of the Wright brothers, stating that he had done so a year earlier. But everyone recognized that his flights had really just crashed into the Potomac River from a ship. Because he was the Smithsonian's leader, using Smithsonian funds to conduct his experiments, they persisted in claiming that Langley invented the first airplane. But they relented during World War II after pressure from the surviving Wright brother pushed them into it. It was not until 1906 that a Brazilian by the name of Alberto Santos Dumont made the first uncontested flight of an airplane. This was basically because it took flight under its own power, flew more than 50 meters, and landed without crashing. But the Wright brothers were already flying miles in distance by that point. It's just because people were skeptical of the claim. So you see how all of this is not clear-cut. Just like Edison, it might be best to say that the Wright brothers invented the first practical airplane, but even that is contentious. In the time before World War I, aviation was still in that awkward phase where people were just throwing whatever ideas they could cram together. The Wright brothers were not the first to make airplanes, nor were they the first aviators, but they also were not the last to make claims of first flight. It wouldn't be until World War I that the science of aviation would be fully brought together, despite centuries of theorizing and iterative invention. All innovation is this way. We need to remember that, so as to better innovate today. The Wright brothers were a significant step in the process of the invention of flight, but only a step, because there's nothing new under the sun.